Congratulations to you and all Australians, all your colleagues at the Olympic Committee and the Australian Olympic Museum on your winning bid to
Yeah,
host
it's
the Olympics
exciting.
for the third time in 2032.
Yeah, super exciting to have the Olympics coming back to Australia. Say the first Olympics held in the Southern Hemisphere was held in Melbourne in 1956, where our museum is based. And then, yeah, we had Sydney 2000 and now Brisbane 2032.
Do you remember where you were when you heard the news? Were you at work? Or no, you're in lockdown, right?
Yeah, so at home, as was much of Australia, I think. Yeah, so we were just at home and saw the news. At least Brisbane was able to celebrate a little bit because they didn't have restrictions on that. They've had things good up there, so it's great. A bit weird this year because you couldn't really have the big celebrations, and also there was only really one, bidder, I suppose, that was considered. So it wasn't really a surprise in the same way as sometimes some of the other ones might have been.
When you go back to work tomorrow, right? Or
Well,
whenever you
hopefully,
go back to work, are you guys going to have a party or something? Like a big
not yet. I don't think. It'll be a while yet before we're able to do that. I think maybe what we can collect out of the current Olympic Games to for our collection, and then we'll start thinking ahead.
It's amazing because I was reading about the number of medals that you've had. I mean, Australia, it's the continent is the country is huge in terms of geography, but you're 23 million population, and you have 532 medals and 156 like gold medals or something. Like before we get into collecting strategy for the museum, what do you guys eat? Like, what is your diet? How do you get to be so like athletic and so healthy and so active? What is it about the Australian temperament and culture and cultural norms that contributes to this sort of athleticism?
Australia definitely punches above its weight in sport. In a lot of different sports, Olympics is just one of those things. Like Australia is usually often, top 10 in the medal tally at the Olympic Games, even though they're not, top 10 in terms of world population or anything like that. The way Australia's identity as a country on the world stage has sort of been constructed and formed, like a lot of that actually came probably out of sport, was one of the big ways as a more recent country in terms of its visibility on the world stage. I mean, there's been civilization and culture here for tens of thousands of years, but in terms of like a federated country, it's only been since 1901. One way that Australia sought to differentiate itself or make itself known on the world stage was through sporting endeavour. So a lot of countries, I guess you'll see, they can be formed by participation in wars. That's can be where a country makes their mark. Australia did that to a certain degree as well. The Melbourne Olympics was quite a big thing, being the first Olympic Games held outside of the Northern Hemisphere. It was called the Friendly Games, so it was like the first games where they had the closing ceremony where all the countries marched together as a way of sort of bringing everybody together to enjoy it. And it was Australia being on the world stage. When you talk about Australia and sport, there's always a big rivalry with England, partly because, the way Australia was settled, and then that sort of rivalry that grew out of that. The first ever international cricket match was between Australia and England. So then anytime Australia are competing against England in something, it's always a really big deal. It started with cricket, but now it extends into everything, and Australia is always very keen to beat England in various things.
As we talked last time, briefly, it's really your learning about the social history of a nation, of a people, of a culture. And that's exactly what you just described. It's the Australian character, really beautifully described, just using sports as its, marking. And in case of your country, it's very pronounced because it's so intuitive and it's so primal as in like very, very sophisticated when you hit the Olympics and, professional sports. You have, what, 66 gold medals in swimming, if I'm not mistaken. 60 gold medals in swimming, 67 silver, 65 bronzes. So that's 192 medals in swimming alone. That's really amazing. Athletics is, in terms of the medals at the Olympics, since, we thought we would focus this particular conversation on the Olympics aspect. So that's the second most number of medals that you have, which is like 73, followed by cycling, rowing, and sailing. What is the order of interest, just as your perception in sports? Like, what are the top 3 or 5 sports that people are interested in?
To be honest, it really depends what part of Australia you're from. Probably the biggest sports are not the Olympic ones. The Olympic ones are really popular every 4 years. The more popular ones on a recurring basis are your cricket, your Australian football, rugby league, rugby union, football or soccer as well. Some of the ways that Indigenous athletes made themselves known or became part of the Australian sporting landscape, I suppose. So there was things like boxing quite early on that there was some people like Lionel Rose and the Sands brothers and things like that. So there was an Indigenous boxing culture there. There's also, had athletics, we had people like Kathy Freeman and Nova Peris and things like that. So we try and incorporate that as well. But I guess what we're also trying to do is not just limit the museum to those showcases. What we don't want to make Indigenous sport a separate issue. We don't want to just have it in its own separate showcases. We're trying to mesh it with everything else that's going on. So we're not necessarily like highlighting and separating it from everything else, but if we're telling a story about the Olympic Games and we can incorporate an Indigenous story just as part of the landscape or tapestry of that story, then we will do that.
But that's the best way to deal with integrating different voices and different narratives rather than kind of marginalizing and ghettoizing, which is what a lot of museums in England, in America, they do that just, and expect to be applauded for, putting things in a separate corner and say, you see, we really, really, really care about these, minority people. But the way you're describing it, that to me is how it should be done.
People aren't going to come to the museum now to see, I want to learn about the history of basketball or I want to learn about the history of Olympic Games. That's what they have Wikipedia for now, which they wouldn't have had necessarily when we opened the museum. So we can tell stories about courage and adversity and like making your mark on the world stage, and you can incorporate any number of different sports into that. And our aim is to incorporate as many sports as possible. We've got, I think, over 90 different sports represented in the museum, whereas before we only had probably less than half that. We had a majority of probably male beforehand, but it was really important to equalize that and fix that up. So that was something that we were also really conscious of as well.